She was a British girl who conquered France, inspired one of the most controversial songs in music history, had the world's most coveted handbag named after her, and spent her entire life fighting for people she had never even met. She was not a queen, she was not a politician, she was not a billionaire. She was just a woman who walked into a room and changed it forever. This is the story of Jane Birkin, and trust me, by the time we are done here, you will never look at a handbag the same way again. Welcome to another educational video on the history of the elites. If this is your first time here, comment below where you're watching from, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on our future videos. There are certain people who exist in this world who seem to be touched by something extraordinary, something that goes beyond talent, beyond beauty, beyond circumstance. They move through life leaving marks so deep that even decades after they are gone, the world is still feeling the impression. Jane Birkin was one of those people. She was born in London but belonged to Paris. She sang in French but never lost her British soul. She was a fashion icon who famously carried her belongings in a straw basket. She was a lover, a mother, an actress, a singer, and an activist. She was contradictory in the most beautiful way possible. And that contradiction is exactly what made her impossible to ignore. Jane Birkin was never trying to be anything. She was not manufactured by a record label. She was not groomed by a fashion house. She simply showed up exactly as she was, and the world decided that was more than enough. In fact, the world decided that was everything. This documentary is not just about a famous woman. It is about a life fully lived, a life of love and heartbreak, of art and activism, of loss and resilience. It is about a woman who redefined what it meant to be a woman in the 20th century, and whose influence stretched so far into the 21st century that we are still talking about her today. So let us go back to the very beginning. Let us go back to London, 1946, and meet the girl who would one day become a legend. Early life and childhood. Jane Mallory Birkin was born on the 14th of December 1946 in Marylebone, London. She came into the world during one of the most transformative periods in modern history. The Second World War had just ended, Europe was rebuilding itself, and Britain was entering a new era of culture and identity. It was a time of change, and in many ways Jane Birkin would spend her entire life embodying that change. Her father was David Birkin, a Royal Navy commander who had served his country with distinction during the war. Her mother was Judy Campbell, a well-known and celebrated British actress and singer who had been a favourite of the legendary playwright Noel Coward. So from the very beginning, Jane was surrounded by creativity, performance, and a deep appreciation for the arts. It was in her blood. Growing up in this environment, Jane was exposed to theatre, music, and storytelling from a very young age. Her mother Judy was a woman of great elegance and artistic sensibility, and she passed those qualities on to her daughter, though Jane would eventually express them in her own entirely unique way. Where her mother was polished and refined, Jane would become effortlessly natural. Where her mother was theatrical, Jane would be real. Jane attended school in London, but she was not necessarily a conventional student. She was curious, sensitive, and deeply imaginative. She felt things deeply, which would later become one of her greatest strengths as a performer. The ability to feel deeply and then communicate those feelings to an audience is a rare gift, and Jane had it in abundance. As a teenager growing up in London in the early 1960s, Jane found herself right in the middle of one of the most exciting cultural explosions the world had ever seen. London was becoming the centre of the universe. The music was electric, the fashion was revolutionary. Young people were rewriting the rules, and Jane, with her natural curiosity and openness, was absorbing all of it. She was tall, slim, and had a quality about her that was both innocent and magnetic. She did not look like she was trying to be beautiful. She just was. And in the London of the 1960s, that kind of effortless, unforced beauty was exactly what the world was hungry for. Her first steps into the spotlight. Jane's entry into the world of entertainment came through acting, which made sense given her mother's background. In 1965, at just 18 years old, she made her stage debut in the West End production of Chekhov's The Seagull. It was a significant first step, and it showed that Jane had inherited her mother's stage presence and then some. But it was her film career that would first bring her to the attention of a wider audience. In 1966, she appeared in Michelangelo Antonioni's groundbreaking film Blow Up. The film was a major cinematic event, a mysterious, stylish, and provocative exploration of London's swinging 60s scene, and Jane's appearance in it, though brief, was memorable. Blow Up went on to win the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival, and being part of such a film, even in a small role, positioned Jane as someone worth watching. Also in 1966, she appeared in the film The Knack, and her presence on screen was becoming increasingly noticed. She had a quality that the camera loved. There was a lightness to her, a translucency almost, as though she was completely open and hiding nothing, and audiences found that deeply compelling. Around this time, Jane also entered into her first significant personal relationship. She married composer John Barry in 1966. John Barry was already a celebrated figure in the music world, best known for composing the iconic James Bond film scores. He was older than Jane and deeply established in his career. Their relationship was passionate but ultimately short-lived. They had a daughter together, Kate Barry, born on the 8th of April, 1967. Tragically, Kate would later die on the 11th of December 2012 after falling from her apartment window in Paris. But that devastating loss was still many decades away. Jane and John Barry's marriage ended, and Jane found herself at a crossroads. She was a young woman with a baby, a budding career, and an entire world of possibilities in front of her. And then, in 1968, everything changed. Jane Birkin went to Paris to audition for a film, and the course of her life was altered forever. The move to France and Serge Gainsbourg. The film was called Slogan, directed by Pierre Grimblat, and it was during the making of this film that Jane Birkin met Serge Gainsbourg. This meeting would become one of the most storied and complicated love stories in the history of French culture. Serge Gainsbourg was already a legend in France by the time Jane met him. Born Lucien Gainsbourg on the 2nd of April 1928 to Russian Jewish immigrant parents, Gainsbourg had built a reputation as a provocateur, a poet, and a musical genius. He was controversial, brilliant, self-destructive, and utterly magnetic. He was also 12 years older than Jane and had a reputation for being difficult. He drank heavily. He was notoriously outspoken. He was the kind of man that mothers warned their daughters about. And yet, when Jane met him, something extraordinary happened. Their chemistry was undeniable and immediate. Gainsbourg, who had a history of being cynical and guarded, was completely disarmed by Jane's openness and authenticity. And Jane, despite everything she knew about him, was drawn into his world with both eyes open. Their relationship became the most talked about romance in France. Here was this young, fresh-faced British girl with her imperfect French and her easy smile, and this complicated, troubled French genius. They were an unlikely pair, and perhaps that was exactly why they worked so beautifully, at least for a time. In 1969, they recorded together what would become one of the most controversial songs in the history of popular music, which translates to "I Love You, Me Neither," was a song that Gainsbourg had originally written and recorded with his previous partner, Brigitte Bardot. Bardot, fearing the impact the song's explicit nature might have on her reputation, had asked that her version not be released. Gainsbourg then recorded it with Jane, and the result was incendiary. The song featured the sounds of passionate lovemaking, with Jane's breathy vocals and Gainsbourg's deep spoken word delivery, creating something that had simply never existed on mainstream radio before. It was banned by the BBC. The Vatican condemned it. Radio stations across Europe refused to play it. And of course, it became an absolute sensation. It reached #1 in the United Kingdom, making Jane and Gainsbourg the first act to achieve that feat with a song that had been banned by the BBC. It was a moment that perfectly captured who Jane Birkin was. She was not trying to be shocking. She was simply being herself, and the world did not know what to do with that. Their personal relationship was equally intense. In 1971, Jane gave birth to their daughter, Charlotte Gainsbourg, on the 21st of July. Charlotte would go on to become one of the most respected and celebrated actresses and musicians of her generation, winning the Best Actress award at the Cannes Film Festival in 2009. The apple, as they say, did not fall far from the tree. Jane and Serge lived together in Paris, and their home became a cultural gathering place. Artists, musicians, writers, and filmmakers passed through their lives. Jane was becoming not just Serge's partner, but a fully formed figure in French culture in her own right. She was learning the language, embracing the culture, and making it her own. But she never became French in the way that erased her Britishness. She remained wonderfully, unmistakably herself. Jane as an actress, building her own career, while her relationship with Gainsbourg was a central part of her public identity during the late 1960s. And through the 1970s, it would be a mistake to reduce Jane Birkin to simply being Gainsbourg's muse. She was building a significant film career entirely on her own terms. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, Jane appeared in an extraordinary range of films, working with some of the most respected directors in European cinema. She appeared in films by Jacques Rivette, including L'amour par terre in 1984 and La Belle Noiseuse in 1991, the latter of which won the Grand Prix at the Cannes Film Festival. She worked with director James Ivory in the 1976 film The Romantic Englishwoman. She appeared in Death on the Nile in 1978, the acclaimed Agatha Christie adaptation featuring a stellar cast, including Peter Ustinov, Bette Davis, and Mia Farrow. She worked with director Agnès Varda, one of the pioneering figures of the French New Wave, and with director Jacques Doyon on multiple projects. Her collaboration with Doyon was particularly significant both professionally and personally, as the two had a relationship for a number of years and had a daughter together, Lou Doyon, born on the 4th of September 1982. Lou would also go on to become a successful actress and musician, making Jane the mother of 3 remarkable daughters, each of whom carved out their own extraordinary careers. What made Jane's acting career so remarkable was the range she displayed. She could be funny and light in comedies, devastating and vulnerable in dramas, and compelling and mysterious in art house films. She was not a one-note performer. She brought genuine intelligence and emotional depth to every role she took on. Directors wanted to work with her not just because of her name or her beauty, but because she was genuinely good. She was committed to the work. She was curious and collaborative, and she had that rare quality of making every scene feel real, even in the most stylized or theatrical context. The music career, finding her own voice. Parallel to her acting work, Jane was also developing a music career that, while always connected to her relationship with Gainsbourg, eventually became something deeply personal and distinctly her own. Throughout the 1970s, she released several albums with Gainsbourg producing, including Dee Doo Da in 1973 and Lolita Go Home in 1975. These albums showcased Jane's voice, which was not a conventional pop voice by any traditional standard. It was thin, airy, and slightly fragile, but that quality was its power. When Jane sang, she sounded like someone telling you the truth. There was no artifice, no performance for performance's sake. She sounded like a real person, and that authenticity cut through everything. Her relationship with Gainsbourg ended in 1980, after 12 years together. By all accounts, it was a painful separation. Gainsbourg struggled enormously with the end of their relationship. Jane, for her part, handled it with the grace and dignity that would characterize how she handled every difficult moment in her life. After their separation, Jane continued to work creatively and eventually began to develop a more independent musical identity. In 1987, she released the album Baby Alone in Babylon, which was produced by Serge Gainsbourg despite their romantic separation. It was a beautiful and melancholy record that showed real artistic growth. And notably, even after their love story ended, Jane and Serge maintained a deep and genuine friendship until his death. Serge Gainsbourg died on the 2nd of March 1991 from a heart attack. He was 62 years old. His death was a profound loss not just for French culture but for Jane personally. She had loved him deeply, and even years after their relationship had ended, that love had never fully disappeared. It had simply transformed into something different, something enduring. Following Gainsbourg's death, Jane threw herself into her music with renewed purpose. In 1996, she released the album Versions Jane, a collection of interpretations of songs originally written for her by Gainsbourg, recorded now with new arrangements by different artists. It was a deeply moving tribute and a demonstration of how inseparable her artistic identity was from the work they had created together. But Jane did not stop there. She continued recording and performing well into the 2000s and beyond. In 2006, she released Fictions, an album that included literary adaptations and showed a willingness to experiment and push boundaries. In 2017, she released Birkin Gainsbourg, Le Symphonique, a live orchestral version of the classic Gainsbourg songs, recorded with the Metropole Orchestra. The album was a critical and commercial success and reminded a new generation of listeners just how extraordinary this body of work truly was. Jane performed this show live across Europe and around the world, even resuming the tour after suffering a minor stroke in 2021 that temporarily halted her performances. She recovered and returned to the stage with the same determination that had always defined her. The Birkin bag, a fashion accident that changed the world. Now we have to talk about the bag, because no documentary about Jane Birkin would be complete without talking about the most famous handbag in the history of the world. In 1984, Jane was on a flight from Paris to London. She was sitting next to Jean-Louis Dumas, the chief executive of the French luxury house Hermès. During the flight, Jane's straw basket, which she was using as a carry-on bag, and which was notoriously stuffed to overflowing with all manner of things, fell from the overhead compartment and spilled its contents everywhere. Jane, characteristically unfazed, began hand-collecting her things and mentioned to Dumas that she had been searching for a decent leather weekend bag, but could never find one that suited her needs.
I have to ask about the bag story.
Yes.
This occurred because you were on an airplane, is that right?
Yes, I was going to London, and they upgraded me. The hostess upgraded me, and I found myself next door to a very polite gentleman, and I'd got my agenda as usual, bang full of bits of paper and everything, and the whole thing fell to the ground. So I picked it up, and he said, you should have pockets in that agenda. And I said, what can you do? Hermès don't make it with pockets. And he said, I am Hermès. I said, oh, then in that case.
Dumas, inspired by the conversation and by Jane herself, took out an in-flight magazine, and together they sketched out the design of a bag on the back of it. That conversation, that chance encounter, led directly to the creation of the Birkin bag, which Hermès officially launched in 1984 and named in Jane's honour. The Birkin bag became the most coveted luxury item in the world. Made entirely by hand by skilled Hermès craftsmen, requiring many hours of work to produce, available only through Hermès boutiques, and often with waiting lists stretching years long.
I was so flattered after the killing and everything. So he gave me my bag. And I never really followed it up much until much, much later somebody said, you know, your handbag is the bag that is selling the most than any bag or something. And when I went to America, I don't know in what interview, they said, you mean Birkin like the bag? So I said, oh, well, now the bag is going to sing. What can I say? And I thought, oh gosh, on my obituary it will say like the bag or something. When someone said, what will you be best known for? I said, the bag, could it be? So I expect so.
It is so funny that after all this, you might be known for a bag.
I might. Well, could be worse.
Yes, could be.
The Birkin bag became the ultimate symbol of wealth, taste, and exclusivity. Prices for a standard Birkin bags start at around €7,000 and can reach hundreds of thousands of euros for rare and exotic versions. Some Birkin bags have sold at auction for over $300,000. The irony of this, and it is a delicious irony that Jane herself appreciated enormously, is that the woman whose name is on the most expensive handbag in the world was herself famously indifferent to luxury and excess. Jane Birkin carried straw baskets. She dressed simply. She was not particularly interested in the trappings of wealth. She was the least likely person in the world to have the world's most expensive bag named after her, and that made it absolutely perfect. There is an additional layer to this story. In 2015, Jane publicly requested that Hermès remove her name from the bag. This came after she learned that the crocodile and exotic skins used in certain versions of the Birkin bag were sourced in ways that she found ethically unacceptable. She specifically cited a PETA investigation into the conditions of crocodiles farmed for their skins. Jane was deeply committed to animal rights, and she was not willing to have her name associated with practices she believed were cruel, regardless of the commercial implications. Hermès responded swiftly and committed to investigating their supply chain. After reviewing their practices and receiving assurances from Hermès regarding improvements, Jane agreed to allow her name to remain on the bag. The whole episode said everything about who Jane Birkin was. She had a name worth millions attached to a product worth billions, and she was willing to walk away from all of it on a matter of principle. Activism and humanitarian work. Fashion and music and film were never enough for Jane Birkin. She had a conscience that simply would not let her be comfortable while others were suffering, and she spent a significant portion of her life using her platform to fight for causes she believed in. Her activism covered a wide range of issues. She was a vocal supporter of human rights across the globe. She spoke out in support of the people of Myanmar during the Rohingya crisis. She was an advocate for LGBTQ rights at a time when such advocacy carried genuine social and professional risk. She spoke publicly about HIV and AIDS during the epidemic of the 1980s and 90s, helping to destigmatize the conversation around the disease. She supported various organizations working to combat poverty and inequality. Jane was also deeply committed to animal rights, as evidenced by her willingness to confront Hermès over the sourcing of exotic skins. She was consistent in her belief that how we treat the most vulnerable, whether human or animal, is the true measure of our civilization. One of the causes closest to her heart was the Campaign for Human Rights in Myanmar, then known as Burma. Jane visited the country and met with activists and ordinary people who were living under brutal military rule. She was moved deeply by what she witnessed and returned to France determined to use her voice to draw attention to their plight. She spoke to French politicians, gave interviews, and used every platform available to her to keep the issue in the public consciousness. Jane was not an armchair activist. She did not simply lend her name to causes and move on. She engaged, she showed up, she was present. And the people she fought for knew that she genuinely cared, not because it was good for her image, but because she was incapable of looking away from suffering. Her humanitarian work was recognized internationally. She received the Légion d'honneur, France's highest order of merit, in 2001, an acknowledgement not just of her cultural contributions, but of her commitment to using her life in service of others. Personal losses and resilience. Life gave Jane Birkin enormous gifts. It also gave her extraordinary pain. And the way she navigated that pain with openness and grace rather than bitterness or retreat is perhaps the most remarkable thing about her. The death of Serge Gainsbourg in 1991 was a loss from which, by her own admission, she never fully recovered. He had been the great love of her life, her creative partner, and one of her closest friends. Losing him left a hole that nothing could entirely fill. But an even more devastating blow came on the 11th of December 2012, when Jane's eldest daughter, Kate Barry, died after falling from the window of her apartment in Paris. Kate was 46 years old. She had been a celebrated photographer whose work had appeared in major publications and galleries. Her death was ruled accidental, but the circumstances were heartbreaking. For a mother to lose a child is an incomprehensible grief. For Jane, who had already known such deep loss, it was almost unbearable. She withdrew from public life for a period. She grieved privately and deeply. And then, because she was Jane Birkin, she eventually found her way back. She channeled her grief into her art. In 2013, she released an album called Enfants d'hiver, which translates to Winter Children, a deeply personal record that dealt directly with loss, grief, and the search for meaning in the aftermath of tragedy. The album was received with enormous critical respect and was understood to be exactly what it was, a mother's reckoning with the loss of her child, expressed through music, because sometimes words alone are simply not enough. Jane also found solace in her relationships with her surviving daughters, Charlotte and Lou, and in her grandchildren. She remained close to her family throughout the final decade of her life and was by all accounts a deeply devoted and present grandmother. The warmth and love that she had always shown to the world, she poured into those closest to her with even greater intensity in the years after Kate's death. In 2021, Jane suffered a minor stroke that required her to temporarily pause her touring schedule. She was 74 years old. The health scare was serious, and for a moment, the world worried that her time on stage might be over. But Jane recovered and returned to performing, completing her orchestral tour of the Gainsbourg songs, and continuing to engage with audiences until very close to the end of her life. Final years and legacy. In the last years of her life, Jane Birkin remained remarkably active. She continued to give interviews, make public appearances, and engage with the cultural conversation. She was sharp, funny, self-deprecating, and utterly without pretension. She spoke openly about aging, about loss, about love, and about what it meant to have lived as fully as she had. She was 83 years old in spirit, if not in years. She had the enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered the world, and the wisdom of someone who had seen most of it twice. She was still Jane, still that open, honest, present, authentic person who had walked into Paris in 1968 and decided, quietly and without fanfare, to stay. Jane Birkin died on the 16th of July 2023, at her home in Paris. She was 76 years old. The cause of death was not immediately specified by her family, though she had been in declining health. The news of her passing sent shockwaves through France, Britain, and the entire world of music, film, and fashion. The tributes that poured in were overwhelming and came from every corner of the globe. French President Emmanuel Macron called her a French icon. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak paid tribute to her extraordinary life. Musicians, actors, designers, and artists from around the world shared their grief and their gratitude for everything she had given. In France, where she had lived for most of her adult life, the outpouring of love was particularly profound. Jane was not just admired in France, she was cherished. She had come to the country as a young British woman and had given it so much of herself that France had, in return, claimed her as its own. She was buried in Paris, in the Montparnasse Cemetery, a resting place for many of the great artistic figures of French culture. It was entirely fitting. Jane Birkin was born in London in 1946. She died in Paris in 2023. In between those two dates, she lived more fully, more honestly, and more beautifully than almost anyone in the history of the world has managed to do. She was not a saint. She was not perfect. She made mistakes and had regrets and carried sorrows that would have broken most people. But she was real, completely, utterly, irreversibly real. And in a world that is constantly pressuring women to be something other than what they are, Jane Birkin's realness was her greatest achievement and her most lasting gift. The next time you see a Birkin bag, remember that it was named after a woman who carried a straw basket. The next time you hear Je t'aime, moi non plus, remember that it was made by two people who actually loved each other. The next time someone tells you that you are too much or not enough, or that you need to be packaged and polished and made more palatable for the world, remember Jane Birkin. She was too much. She was not enough. She was imperfect and contradictory and complicated, and she was, without question, one of the most magnificent human beings the 20th century produced. Rest in peace, Jane. Paris misses you. The world misses you. And those of us who never even met you miss something we cannot quite name. The feeling that somewhere in the world, there is a woman carrying a straw basket through the streets of Paris, completely unbothered, completely herself, and completely extraordinary. This documentary was produced for educational purposes. All facts presented have been researched to the best of available historical sources. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves history as much as you do.